David, I spent a considerable amount of time driving around town trying to find a hotel with good internet, and only to wake up this morning and have no electricity in this hotel. It's ridiculous, but it's
Well, they
back
must be
now.
trying to interfere with our conversations.
That was, certainly where my mind went, but I don't know how somebody could target this hotel for an electrical failure. Anything is possible, I suppose. And, we've got a great show planned for today, David. I think most people know that you and I are doing sponsor exclusive shows on Fridays that people can see on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and Subscribestar or Patreon/crowdsource the truth. And David, I've been working to get this Crowdsource the Truth server going with both Subscribestar and Patreon. It's working now on Subscribestar, and sponsors who watch us there are participating in the beta test of the thing. I'm now in communication with some of the technical people at Patreon to try to get it working there as well. So I'm hopeful by this time next week, all sponsors will be able to enjoy that new technology. But today, we're going to be talking about this interesting topic that you've brought to our attention, the concept of RICO games. What can you tell us about this, David? We got to explain it to everybody, I think.
Yeah, sure. Well, the RICO Act, I think they called it the Crime Bill, was passed in 1970, and it caused consternation, I believe, amongst the organized crime groups and what should we call the revolutionary guerrilla organizations that were infecting the Five Eyes countries, because they do like to reserve the option of murder for hire, right? Where murder for hire is one of the crimes specified under the federal RICO legislation, which goes something along the lines: anyone uses or travels or induces the victim to use or travel in interstate or foreign commerce for the purposes of murder for hire, where death results, is looking at life imprisonment or the death sentence. So what the RICO Act did, it separated the enterprise from the defendants. So the enterprise had to exhibit a pattern of racketeering activity, of which sexual exploitation of children, obstruction of justice, and criminal investigations and murder for hire were examples, and separate that from defendants who would be brought into court by association, but not necessarily full employment with the racketeering enterprise. So the immediate reaction, because these people are not stupid and many of their children have gone to Harvard, which doesn't mean that they're clever, but it does mean that they're trying to upgrade the quality of their criminal logic, if you will. They realize that perhaps the United States was not the haven for organized crime that it used to have been. So they decamped to Vancouver, right, where Canadian laws don't deal with that kind of crime, because in Canada we believe in peace, order, and good government. And so when we're told what to do, we do it, which is witness the present. We're all wandering around. They've just shut down interior dining in restaurants. I mean,
Again.
It has a catastrophe. Well, you used to be able to eat, the tables in the restaurant were put out with a bit of spacing. And I used to have, a couple of friends that I go and have dinner with a Thursday night. And now we're excluded. We have to go out onto the patio. And if it's raining, basically these people are out to kill the middle class business owner and destroy the family. And they're doing a great job of it, right? So back to racketeering, influence and corrupt organization. If we look at this isn't a diversion, but it's very important. In the title of today's show, we talk about the Trudeau rules, right? So let's use a little bit of imagery that connects what I think are the Trudeau rules, which are listen and obey. And that goes back to Pierre Trudeau and his hero worship of every useless global dictator that he could meet with, including Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro and Moscow in 1952. So there on Justin Trudeau's shoulder, you've got a winged figure, right, which has a lot of resemblance to two other images or icons. One is the icon outside the building near Starnet in the downtown east side of Vancouver, right, where we were told by, when you and I were up there, and I think that was a fascinating trip, we were told by someone walking in the street that this was a warning, all right? We didn't explore it in too much detail, and we can interpret it in multiple ways, but there's
But
another...
he answered immediately with that
Yes, he did.
concept that it was a warning. He did not seem to have any doubt.
Now, we're talking about the downtown east side, the poorest postcode in Canada, where up to 100 women and children were abducted from the streets and murdered, either at Starnet or out at the pig farm. But then we have this amazing carving outside BBC Broadcasting House.
Wait, hang on, David. I can barely keep up with you here. I'm still trying to show everybody Starnet Communications. Oops. Okay.
All right. Well, I can talk while you're looking for that, because I think it'll be very obvious to the listeners that we've got an iconographic line of continuity, if you will. So if they remember the shoulder tattoo of Justin Trudeau, and then, yes, there we are, you're going to zoom in on that mural, and a resident in that street or that area, which is the poorest postcode in Canada, which has a tragic record, because close by there is a building of Starnet Communications, which was raided in 1999 because it was apparently engaged in, this is very important, hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries, where the market cap of Starnet was well on the way to $1 billion. Now that, to me, ought to be a classic racketeering, influence, and corrupt organization. And it was built very quickly, Jason. It started in 1996 when Justin Trudeau arrived in BC as a snowboarder / son of a former prime minister / roommate of a guy who between 1997 and 2010 appears to have directed an international pedophile ring, right? Where he was convicted and jailed in 2010. But by that time, I would suggest Starnet and Justin Trudeau's roommate had built a facility for tracking abused children, their abusers, through hotel rooms, Revenue Canada, welfare, hospitals and schools, such that this would, in the United States, I think, fit a classic pattern of racketeering activity. But being in Canada, it was outside the reach of the FBI, except on 20th of August of 1999, when what I think is patently obvious, a racketeering and influence corrupt organization in Canada was raided by 150 law enforcement officers, including representatives from the FBI, the CIA, US Customs, IRS, Port Coquitlam Police, Vancouver Police, and the RCMP, right? And I think they removed activity. I think they obstructed justice that involved the sexual exploitation of children that needed a criminal investigation then and does now, right? Now, there's another raid that takes place. Well, it's not a raid. It's escorting someone off the premises. And I'm talking now about the racketeering federal crime recognized as obstruction of justice and criminal investigation, which you and I do on a regular basis every Friday, and many of your guests do. We are doing investigation into crime because it appears that the police, the CIA, the RCMP don't know how to do that anymore. Right? So, for example, we have two major crises through which people like Trudeau can control the human race. One is the trafficking or sexual exploitation of children. And second, the smuggling of stolen pathogens from the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, where the RCMP, who escorted this woman off the premises, have refused to answer any questions about why and what she took, where she took it, and what were the consequences. So the RCMP has totally failed, right, to investigate the theft of pathogens from the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, and totally failed to investigate the trafficking or sexual exploitation of children, not just in BC, but around the world. Apparently those are the two of the most profitable trade. So back to Maximus in 1998, where it was formed in 1975, a few years after the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1970 launched a funding program for the sterilization of children, predominantly the children of poor black mothers, because in 1973, there was a case in Montgomery, Alabama, against a government authority, or maybe it was a private organization, that had sterilized two young black girls. And the claim was that the mother, who was semi-literate or illiterate, didn't understand or give her consent to that sterilization.
Sorry, David, just to interject something quickly on that last topic before we move on to this. You know, there was, over a week ago, some demand from the Canadian Parliament for them to explain what was going on with that Dr. Key, or whatever her name is. And they said on March 22nd that the president of PHAC, which is that Canadian Health Authority or whatever, was given until Friday to tell them why the scientists were let go. But that was over a week ago, and what have we heard about this? Anything?
Well, nothing further, but there's two very clear cases, I believe, of a RICO crime or a federal crime, if it had happened in the United States, because American jurisdiction doesn't reach into Canada, which is why the mob and crime groups and revolutionary guerrilla organizations, I believe, decamped into Vancouver. Often people talk about Montreal as a center for crime, but if you look at let's just look at the federal RICO crimes, and you'll see that in Vancouver, there's there's examples. It's called bribery, various fraud offenses, gambling offenses. Remember, Starnet was involved in gambling, right? Money laundering. Vancouver is a global hub of dirty money and has been for decades, right? Built around, for example, the River Rock Casino out in Richmond. Those two crime groups serviced by Phantom Secure and is it Global Sky or Sky Global?
Yeah.
You know, the more recent outfit, right? So a number of financial and economic crimes, obstructing justice or a criminal investigation. That raid on Starnet by 150 law enforcement officers was a clear example of obstructing justice through spoliation of evidence at the crime scene. They took it all away, right? Murder for hire. Well, under the Trudeau administration, the late Pierre and Justin, Pierre, I think he got his second term as the prime minister in 1980. 4,000 Aboriginal women have been murdered or gone missing across Canada, and almost none of those murders have been solved. You know, they want us to look at some rogue, crazy truck driver, but if you look at the technology allegedly transferred by Pierre Trudeau to the Communist Chinese from McDonald Detweiler, I believe to kill or disappear 4,000 Aboriginal women since 1980, they need a sophisticated tracking technology, right, to check where the good police are. So if there's any good police in the area of the abduction, they sent out of away from the crime scene. The bad police come in, the women disappear, they're taken to a place like Starnet and evidently involved or used in hardcore adult and child pornography. There you have a racketeering operation based in Vancouver, hiding from authorities in the United States and the justice system, or what's left of it. Now, if you look at the image of on the front page of your collage today, I was looking at the symbol that you put associated with Maximus. And there's a building there, right?
That's their symbol, though.
Okay, but that's important. Do you know what I think they're saying here? if you look at the Justice, the Department, what is it? The building, the Federal Justice Department in Washington.
The DOJ building?
Yeah, the DOJ building. It's identical to the Maximus.
To this Maximus
symbol.
thing? Huh.
Correct, isn't it? Now, so what I believe Maximus is saying, obliquely or otherwise, because these people think they're smarter than we are, is we captured the Department of Justice, right, by 1998, right? And I think they did, because the Justice Department, when you think about it, or the Federal Justice Building, right, you've got them attempting to introduce and enforce federal RICO laws, but utterly failing to recognize that by setting up a RICO operation in Vancouver, they can evade the punishments or the penalties of, for example, murder for hire. So under Justin Trudeau and Pierre Trudeau, I believe the Department of Justice in the United States was hijacked, and they used Vancouver as the base for these crimes.
So, David,
let's
here's
just look
real quick.
Yeah, sure.
The Department of Justice headquarters, I believe, is contained inside the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. building, which is this.
Right. Well, I don't see an iota of difference between the Greek facade of the Federal Justice Building and the icon of Maximus. Now, that might be just coincidence until we look into what contract sent the revenues of Maximus skywards, and that is the introduction. This, I think, is a clear example of them being having a little too much pride. When that legislation was introduced by Clinton called the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, it is totally unambiguous to me. They're punishing parents, right? Defining them as deadbeat. And then, of course, you can deploy deadbeat parents who are now desperate to have access to their children, right? Or avoid jail because they haven't paid their child support payments. So you now have a private organization with private shareholders. And let me just give you a flavor of who the shareholders are. BlackRock, Vanguard, Victory, McKinsey, and State Street own about 30% of Maximus shares. All of those are Serco shareholders. And I've been going
McKinsey.
on.
Chelsea
Yes,
Clinton worked for McKinsey.
Financial Corp. McKinsey,
Chelsea
yeah.
Clinton used to work for them.
Is that right? Right. So what they did is they brought together a cartel of bankers, a couple of pension funds, and this is very important because I'm talking about the Serco shareholders now, that included the University Superannuation Scheme in the United Kingdom and the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association in the United States, which would do the retirement benefits for Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack and Hussein and Michelle Obama, and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn. And let me tell you about what I think about intellectuals. People accuse me of being intellectual, and I bristle. I don't want to be an intellectual, right? Right? I believe myself to be intelligent, and I'd like to be recognized as such if people look at the legacy of what I've done. But now let me tell you something about intellectuals, and I do have intellectual friends. A lot of intellectuals and computer scientists get very impatient if they're not recognized. So certain kinds of intellectuals of a rather weak nature will rather default to, well, I'm smarter than you are, listen and obey. Right? So I believe the Trudeau rules. Trudeau would describe himself, I'm quite sure, as an intellectual, right? In meeting with Mao Zedong probably in 1960, and then again in 1973 and signing a trade agreement, I think he reflects the rules of this statue, if you will, or carving outside BBC Broadcasting House, where you have these winged figures serenading, I would suggest, a sexualized boy Christ who's spread out on the cross, where one of the angels or Luciferian figures or whatever is holding to the boy's crotch a book on which it says obsculta, which is the first word in the Benedictine Creed, which a listener told us, and I thank her very much because we may never have found it, is listen and obey. And this statue was carved in 1934. You and I have looked at it. We filmed it, right? So what is the BBC saying? BBC saying the idea of the prisoner's dilemma game was introduced in wargaming by the Rand Corporation in the 1920s. And what I just said to you, I suddenly had an epiphany.
The Rand Corporation.
Yes, for wargaming, iterated prisoner's dilemma game, right? So I had.
What do you mean for
wargaming?
wargaming? It's a strategy problem,
yes,
right?
You
Like
develop,
a logic
I
problem.
do this, you do this, I do this, you do this. So, for example, the Second Bureau of the People's Liberation Army is involved in collecting human intelligence and operating clandestine groups behind enemy lines, which I believe includes Meng Wanzhou, who arrived in Vancouver in 2001. But I digress. The idea of an iterated prisoner's dilemma game is I make a move, then it's your turn. I watch you to see what you do. It's a bit like chess. And then I make a move that corresponds or reflects what I think your intent is in terms of your move. And you and I have discussed ad nauseum the idea of the iterated prisoner's dilemma game and the fact that the People's Liberation Army seem to be introducing the idea of extortion to control the degrees of freedom of the target, so that, for example, in the place I go and eat or have been eating regularly in White Rock, I go into the food hall, and traditionally I've been able to sit down with people, 6 feet, and take off the mask because I need to take off the mask to order and eat. What they've now done is they've ramped up in light of mutating pathogens. That all the restaurants now, they can't eat inside, right? When is it going to stop, Jason? These people are basically destroying family businesses and middle classes and attacking parents because they know, going back to Karl Marx and like 1848, he said, abolition of marriage, even the most radical flare up at the infamous suggestion of the communists. If you introduce the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, it's very obvious, this was done under the Bill Clinton regime in 1998, you are intending to destroy the family by defining the parents of any broken relationship as deadbeat. This isn't justice. This is propaganda, and it has consequences, right?
But wait a minute,
Words
David.
have consequences. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering if the Vancouver Sun is now going to be banned from things because they're telling people that British Columbia announced that it's pausing the Oxford double-cross AstraZeneca vaccine after federal immunization experts recommend it not be used on people under the age of 55. I mean, according to YouTube, that sounds like they're spreading medical misinformation and they should be banned.
Well, they always have that option because if they deem you to be spreading information,
Not me. I'm
not
talking
you,
about the
but
Vancouver Sun.
anyone. But the point is, it comes back to the idea that Maximus is, I believe, a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization whose shareholders tried to dodge the consequences of the introduction of the Crime Act in 1970 by migrating their operations into Vancouver and setting up a global hub for money laundering, murder for hire, sexual exploitation of children, and obstruction of justice and criminal investigation. And it's been very successful because in Vancouver, if you look at it, there's a building boom of dirty money coming out, I believe, from China, right, being laundered through River Rock Casino and feeding a real estate boom. Meanwhile, the little businesses are shutting down. People, I see the fear in their faces, Jason. All right. I look at New York, and your experience in New York, and I believe what Americans need to do is recognizing Maximus as a RICO and take certain appropriate steps that are available, right? And there's a number of remedies, including injunctive relief, but I don't want to go into too much about detail. I want to map out this thread of criminality with which the Maximus Inc. shareholders can use a huge community of what they have defined as deadbeat parents as people who can go into the last mile and the first mile of a criminal supply chain that is supplying, for example, pathogens or mutating pathogens and abducted children. Think about it, right? The abducted children trade was presumably pioneered by Justin Trudeau and his roommate starting around the 1996 period, with the license given to Starnet Communications at 425 Carroll Street, which it used to produce hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries and build a business whose market cap was heading towards $1 billion by the time of the raid of 1999. Right? So now what you've got is the RCMP, the Vancouver police, the high-tech squad from Ottawa, the Port Coquitlam police, the CIA, the IRS, and the FBI, and the United States Customs Service together conspire to raid Starnet and take away all the evidence of the sexual exploitation of children. And that in itself is obstruction of justice and a criminal investigation. That is a racketeering offense, except it's not in the United States. So the American Department of Justice has not recognized that crime. And remember, Maximus is registered in Reston, Virginia, right? 1.25 miles from Serco's US headquarters. And Serco's shareholders control Maximus.
Well, David, I wanted to ask you about this. Because just a little bit less than a year ago, it seems the Canadian Broadcasting Company, they agree with you. They had this article that said that the Vancouver model for money laundering, it's unprecedented in Canada and probably anywhere. This inquiry heard a year ago. I don't know, did you see this article?
Yeah. Basically, the law enforcement authorities in BC and Vancouver and Canada are overwhelmed. They don't have the networks, the platforms, the heterogeneous networks. Remember that term in the paper by the, what I think is the Second Bureau of the People's Liberation Army? Those four guys who write, what is it? The evolution of extortion in iterated prisoner's dilemma, right? And the idea was to use social influencing to get people to concentrate on, let's say, masks, have you had your vaccine, right, and keep 6 feet away from me, and not on the overall strategy laid down by Pierre Trudeau for global population control, including, for example, the culling of 330 million female fetuses in China between 1980 and 2015, or the removal of certain groups, like now they believe that seniors are too big a drag on Obamacare, so they should be culled. So they mutate the pathogen, and this is the cycle of organized crime. I think what we're seeing now is that in an iterated listener's dilemma game, they introduce a virus by stealing it from the NML lab, taking it to Wuhan City, causing a hotspot outbreak, and then racing to develop a vaccine, which they then say you've got to be vaccinated before you can go into a bank or travel. Then they introduce a mutation, right? Then it requires another vaccine. So we keep going through a cycle. This is the
iterated game, isn't it?
Yes, it's the and I'm now calling it the iterated listeners game, because they present to the listeners, for example, of the BBC, the world's leading broadcaster of 500 million people, right, in 50 languages, they put them on an iterated listeners game. They don't tell them that in many cases the spread of the body counts is being driven by artificial intelligence algorithms. So the public is whipsawed between a digital threat and a real threat, right? And the online theft of intellectual property, and here I'm going to come to Meng Wanzhou, that allows you to produce that iterated listeners game using modern communications technology. So let's go to
Well,
Meng. Go ahead. Go ahead.
but the thing I wanted to ask you about, David, is that you're talking about stuff that YouTube does want to kick us off for, but it's interesting because just the other day, the former CDC director, I was trying to get the Baltimore Sun to come up here because they're describing him as Donald Trump's CDC director, but the guy was there long before Trump ever showed up. It was Robert Redfield, the already highly questionable director of the CDC, who said now, just a week ago, that he believes that the virus came from a lab. And so they're trying to minimize what he's saying by associating him with Trump. And now that they've used the 17th letter of the alphabet and a variety of other things to make it so that the mainstream news can describe anyone and anything having to do with Donald Trump as being crazy, all they need to do is have this guy come out and say it and say that he was the director under Trump. And there's a huge group of people who will not believe it.
And that's interesting, you see, because what he says, I'm not a biologist, but I describe myself as, let's say, an intelligent, natural and unnatural scientist, if you will. What I said and what I understood from the BBC documentary Contagion ! Is when Dr. Hannah Fry appeared at the beginning, she said she was a patient zero. So I've read around the subject of, pathogens and that sort of thing, and it would appear that if you're a patient zero and you've been infected by a virus that's jumped out of bat soup or civet cats or whatever, it goes into the human being and the lock and key, the protein spikes, it's not an exact match. So it takes a lot of replications of the virus and mutations of the virus before it takes off into the human community, right? So you don't get hotspots from patient zeros. Now, in the case of Dr. Hannah Fry, what she created with the BBC and various computer scientists from Imperial College and so on is a set of artificial intelligence algorithms that could be programmed to reflect certain assumptions like washing hands or the distance between people or the age groups. So the figures coming out of the documentary Contagion! Have now, I believe, spilled over through a racketeering influence and corrupt organization like Maximus, right? Such that the infection, the digital infection and the real infection could be spread by people who listen and obey, like the deadbeat parents targeted by the Clinton Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act. So what they I believe they built, Maximus has built you could call it, I think, a revolutionary guerrilla organization of disaffected, alienated, and radicalized parents that are being basically broken up from their family and turned into weapons, if you will.
We did hear, David, a lot of people being arrested for the January 6th thing with the Capitol. Mother of six, they're talking about how they're parents.
And, exactly. One of the guys who's hacking away at you has, I don't want to get personal, but he's got a family situation that is incredibly stressful. And right. I believe when they introduced the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, they specifically, and that would be Pierre Trudeau and Bill Clinton, I'm going to come back to them in terms of pathogen in a minute, they specifically recognize that if you can break up a marriage and alienate the children from either one side or the other side or both sides, you could take the children into caregivers, what do I call it, foster care, right? And move them into the sexual exploitation of children on a global scale because they no longer have the protection of their parents. This is a criminal organization based in Vancouver.
And not only that, David, this relationship of the parent to the child is unique. That can't be broken no matter what. Even if a person never sees their child for 40 years and then connects with them, that's still the parent and child versus a marriage can be ended in divorce. And it does seem like the bond, I mean, it's difficult for me to talk about this because I don't have children, but the bond between a parent and a child, that's really a lever that these people who want to achieve evil are, pressing on, because you really can get somebody to do a lot of things by threatening their children.
Yeah, so let's just bounce between sexual exploitation of children, I believe, by Maximus, and the theft and gain of function research into pathogens. So when did that begin, this idea that you could take a pathogen from one source, do some gain of function research and development, and turn it into something else? Well, it appears to have begun in the 70s, right? When physicians from the Arkansas hospital began collecting prison blood, right? And then in the 1970s, of course, you get Bill Clinton slithers his way into the governorship of Arkansas. I use slither purposely because I think this man's behavior is reprehensible, but then perhaps I'm just being polite or nasty. Anyway, the guy develops a prison blood trade where blood is taken from prisoners in the Arkansas correction system at $7 a pint paid in script and shipped up to Connaught Laboratories in Toronto, where it's fractionated. And I believe at Connaught Laboratories, it had been privatized in 1972 by Pierre Trudeau. I believe in Connaught Laboratories at the University of Toronto, they started doing gain of function research, and they converted some of that prison blood into Hep C and HIV, and actually
I think that
pumped this.
makes a lot of sense, David. And that also makes sense that they would take it to China. I'm sorry to interrupt and redirect, but there's something breaking, David. A car has rammed some kind of barricade at the Capitol building, and there's a whole big to-do going on there. This tweeter has posted that a helicopter just landed there, and that he's never, ever, ever seen anything like this. More shenanigans at the Capitol.
Well, totally. And now, that specific instance, I'm not too sure about, but let's just stay with the knitting on the pathogen. So by 1980, there was a fully fledged trade in, I believe, mutated or added gain of function pathogens coming out of the Arkansas prison system under Bill Clinton and into the Connaught Laboratories to be exported around the world and injure millions and kill hundreds of thousands of people with Hep C and HIV. So Connaught was well practiced at the idea of gain of function research. And here's some more interesting timing. In 1998, the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg got a level 4 laboratory. Right? And with a level 4 laboratory, you can do gain of function research more efficiently because it is protected, in theory, against deadly pathogens unless they're being smuggled out. And it would appear from the evidence that the pathogens were smuggled out of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, escorted by the RCMP.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between the raid on StarNet, which was involved in hardcore adult and child pornography into 60 countries and online gaming, that being raided by the RCMP, and the leader of the raid on StarNet was Bob Paulson in 1999, who would go on to become the commissioner of the RCMP, who would fast-track Dr. Cameron Ortis' research into, presumably, compromised nodes and East Asian cybersecurity. Over to you.
Right, and thank you for reminding me, David. I need to check this week to see if anything has become of Cameron Ortis. It seems like every week we're talking about him. And here's Bob Paulson just sitting there smiling. If I Google Cameron Ortis, it wants to bring up Cameron Diaz. No news. Nothing new about Cameron Ortis this week.
They're obstructing justice. So there are three issues that I believe relate to the need to recognize Maximus Inc. as a racketeering influence corrupt organization, essentially hiding its operations in Vancouver. First of all, there's the raid presumably led by Bob Paulson in August of 1999 on Starnet, which is engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography. Now, that should send a shiver down the collective necks of Canadians and Americans, because I believe 99% of us want the children protected and not abused. But if you have an organization that is engaged in hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries and online gaming that goes from 1996 to a startup into a market cap of $1 billion, you've got a problem, right? When I say you, the collective parents around the world, the 60 countries that were importing this garbage and presumably downloading it and entrapping a certain number of people who perhaps download pornography and get trapped into downloading child pornography and record it with their credit cards. And then they're subsequently arrested and accused of downloading child pornography, and 33 of them commit suicide. Right?
David, DMC is with us in the comments. Could be Darryl McDaniels or the DeLorean Motor Corporation, but they're saying that Paulson is dirty. And I think we know that from other sources as well.
Right. Well, so he's in charge of removing evidence or obstructing justice and a criminal investigation at Starnet. He would appear to be, at least in effect his predecessors or successors, involved in the obstruction of justice and criminal investigation related to the smuggling of pathogens out of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg to Wuhan City. So why wouldn't we assume that a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization is controlling society using its deadbeat listen and obey rules that go back to the 1930s or the BBC in the 1920s through two techniques. One is through the smuggling of abducted children and the associated entrapment and blackmail and extortion of the people on the receiving end of that. And the other is the smuggling of pathogens mutated to get people into this cycle of you take the vaccine and then they introduce a new virus. So I think in Ontario, they're up to the third wave. But arbitrarily, they could continue with gain of function research amongst a corrupt and compromised network of laboratories, of which there are 15 in the United States, 4 in China, and 1 in Canada at the National Microbiology Lab, where you actually have what I would describe as the intellectuals saying, okay, the public won't listen to us when we are doing our cerebration and they don't think we're actually very smart. So let's make the public listen and obey. Over to you.
You know, it's interesting, David. I think that that's exactly right. And, you know, as I look at this picture of Justin Trudeau, I don't know if this is Mao, but this came up when I searched for...
That's Chow and Lai.
Well, he's having Chinese food with the guy. He looks delighted. Yeah. Who is that Chow and Lai?
That's Chow and Lai. He was, is it the vice president under Mao Zedong? They both died in 1976. But it's very important to know what Pierre Trudeau did. So he privatized the Connaught Lab in 1972 and left it free under private ownership to start developing this gain of function, which I think injected HIV and Hep C into the global community.
I mean, it's essentially biological weapons research, the gain of function. Like, why would you want a virus to gain a function? I think we would probably want to kill all viruses. I mean, what viruses are helping us?
Yes. You'd want to neutralize. A virus is not a living thing. It's a cell that replicates using the...
You don't want to give them more capabilities. Why do you want them to have more functions?
Well, that's a very good point. So the funding for gain of function research was suspended, or there was a moratorium during, I believe, the Obama administration. That moratorium was lifted in 2017, right? And that allowed money being stolen from Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, through Serco, which got a $1.2 billion contract to administer Obamacare or Affordable Care. And I believe that Serco then funneled that money into the National Microbiology Lab to take H1N1, for example, which affected children, into COVID-19, which is a very good tool for culling seniors like me. So I believe these people, they can target anyone, but I believe I'm in the target or the crosshairs because I've been doing, I believe, good, thorough, logical and rational crime scene investigations since I smelt corruption in BC when I arrived in 92. Now, I didn't have the knowledge that I have now, but you remember I met with John MacDonald Detweiler in 1995. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I wanted to explore whether or not a company I had been working with in the United Kingdom could buy up MacDonald Detweiler. But MacDonald Detweiler, I believe, provided the basic technology for population control, the tracking of escorts, if you will, using a combination of satellite imagery and their mobile radio data management system, which eventually they sold to Motorola. And incidentally, Motorola is one of the organizations that alleges theft of its intellectual property by Huawei. And if people think we are perhaps exaggerating about RICO, remember Huawei, together with Meng Wanzhou, who I believe has been working with Justin Trudeau since 2001, when she arrived in Vancouver, is charged under RICO with theft of intellectual property. What I'm saying is this is an Eastern District Court, Supreme Court, or whatever it's called, right? And what Justin Trudeau is desperately trying to do is keep her out of the hands of the Americans, because he knows if she goes to the Brooklyn court and faces that trial, this overall conspiracy of the RICO game with Trudeau rules, I believe, will be exposed. Over to you.
Yeah, Trudeau family seems to really love Chinese dictators, no matter who they are.
That's probably the greatest killer. Mao Zedong is the greatest killer of the 20th century. Probably 65 million dead resulting from his administration. Now, this is fodder to the intellectuals of a certain type. Remember the number of dead that Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn thought they would need if Americans refused their socialist re-education camp. Well, it's coming your way like an express train, because increasingly, incrementally, iteratively, they're taking over every aspect of our lives, and they're aiming very much at the idea of marriage, the breaking up of the family, the crushing and destruction of family-owned businesses like yours. Now, there are remedies under RICO, which is for damages, right, for an individual who can demonstrate they have been damaged either personally or financially by an enterprise that exhibits a pattern of racketeering activity. Over to you.
Yeah, but the problem is we've got to get the Department of Justice to actually prosecute anybody. I can't even get the cops to do anything. But David, we're just about out of time. We have a few minutes left here on YouTube before we make the transition over to our sponsor exclusive segment. People can watch that by going to subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI or patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards. People can also see it on subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, it's the second of the month. So now is a good time for people to sign up and become sponsors. There's a huge library on there that they can enjoy. Anything you want to discuss briefly, David, before we transition over to Subscribestar and Patreon?
Yeah, I'd just like to read out 3 lines of what I think summarizes the situation that's brought me to the present. The question is, did Maximus launch a global RICO game in 1998? And then, can we protect parents from Trudeau deadbeat rules, which obstruct crime scene investigation and hide the theft of pathogens, murder for hire, and sexual exploitation of children? If I leave nothing behind me but that thought, a compelling couple of questions yet to be answered, I think I've succeeded. Over to you.
Well said, David. With that, we'll see everybody on Subscribestar and Patreon in just about 10 minutes. I want to thank all the generous sponsors, David, who make this and every show on Crowdsource the Truth Possible. Couldn't do it without you. So please join us on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, or subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you in just a little bit.
Thank you, Jason.